everybody, John Huber here, Maryland K12. I want to talk to you a little bit about special education. What is special education? Why is it important? How is it implemented? First of all, special education is almost a cult, if you will. It is a huge, like a subculture of current and past K-12 education. It is education specifically designed to meet the unique needs of individual students. Yes, individual students. That's the key. So students who have a disability are entitled to have education that is crafted to meet their specific needs. Now, why is it important? It's very simply important because it allows every child to have access to education, even if he or she has some type of a disability or a handicap, as some people may still refer to them as. In order to really understand how special ed is implemented, you kind of understand a little bit of the history of it. So I'm going to give a little bit of overview, a little bit of history, and that's where this video is going to end. And then I'll have a handful of other videos to talk about some specific things about special education. In the early mid-1800s, schools were essentially excluding kids because they had disabilities. And it was perfectly legal for them to do that. And then other schools started to pop up. You know, this is when we started having schools for the deaf, schools for the blind. In 1864, we had the Columbian Institution, which was the first college for disabled Americans. Then there were a series of court cases and different things that happened. In 1919, there was a case called Beatty versus the Board. And in Beatty versus the Board, a student in a school was expelled from the school because he was drooling. And what they found out was that this student had some type of a facial disability where he couldn't control the muscles in his face, whatnot. His intellect was perfectly fine. He had no issue with his intellectual ability. And he was drooling, and the school essentially kicked him out because he was disabled and he was causing a disruption. So the parents sued and all that, and it went to, I think it was in Michigan or Wisconsin, can't remember which one. The Supreme Court of the state ruled that the school was perfectly within its right to kick him out for that and had no problem. As a matter of fact, in that case, they actually recommended that he attend school for the blind or the deaf or something like that. Now, you can talk about a wrong placement. And essentially, they started to slowly allow a lot of the disabled students into the schools, but for the most part, they kept them segregated, separated. Now, I'm not talking about racial segregation. I'm talking about, handicapped versus non-handicapped. Students who had disabilities were basically put in other schools. They were separated, and that's how the schools kind of got through all this. And in 1965, there was a big piece of legislation, the Elementary Secondary Education Schools Act under President Johnson. That kind of incorporated more students, but they were still, for the most part, segregated. 1971 was a big year. There were two very important cases in that year. One was called Park versus Penn. Park is PARC, stands for the Pennsylvania Association of Retarded Children. I think that's what it stands for. And in Park versus Penn in 1971, the court ruled that the students could not be, these were intellectually disabled students, just intellectually disabled. They could not be excluded from the school, or they could not be excluded from public education. The court believed that these children still would benefit from the public education services that all the other children were being provided, and therefore they could not be excluded from receiving those services. Didn't talk about having them all in the same school and that sort of thing, but essentially, if you're going to have public school for everybody, then you have to have public school for these children as well. That was primarily about intellectual disabilities. And then also in 1971, we had Mills versus the Board of Education. This was right down the street in Washington, D.C. What happened in that one is the court decided that, parents sued for the same purposes as Park versus Penn. But in this case, it was a multitude of disabilities. This had to do with physical disabilities as well as intellectual disabilities and emotional disabilities. The whole gamut of disabilities was included under Mills. So once those two passed, now the schools were kind of required to provide education for all students. And then the big one, PL 94-142. Anyone who's ever taken any education class, even if you're a non-education major, you're taking some education, they always talk about 94-142. This was the we refer to this as today as IDEA, which I'll talk about in a second. But 94-142 was the fundamental piece of legislation under which all special ed operates today. This is the legislation where we came up with the idea of the IEP, the individualized education program, the IEP. This is where we came up with the term LRE, least restrictive environment, FAPE, FAPE, free and appropriate public education. All of these terms came up under 94-142, which was originally called the Education of All Handicapped Children Act. It was reauthorized in 1990 and called IDEA, which I'll get to in a second. But anyway, this is the fundamental piece of legislation. And this is where the federal law says not only can you not discriminate against them, not only can you not exclude them because of this, you have to include them, but you have to instruct them based on their unique and individual needs. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what special education is based on. And it is very, very difficult to do. And I'll get into all that throughout my series on this topic. After that, there was a little bit of a thing in 1980 where President Reagan added some amendments, or he didn't add, well, the process, under President Reagan, they added some amendments which gave families more voice in the IEP team, which used to be called the ARD team, for those who've been around. Stands for admissions, retention, and dismissal, or something like that. Anyway, the whole thing in 1980 was it gave parents more of an avenue if they disagreed, gave them more of a voice on the team. In 1990, under the first Bush, H.W. Bush, there was a reauthorization, and this is where we get the term IDEA. IDEA was a reauthorization of 94-142. It came in 1990. It was huge. This is where the whole idea of inclusion came from, because prior to 1990, you had to kind of include them in the schools, but you kind of had these separate classrooms, the small little class. Inclusion all kind of began in the 1990s, where he said, look, we're talking about least restrictive environment. They really doubled down on that. That meant more kids into the regular classroom to be taught with accommodations. I'll explain all the details of that in other videos, but that is the basis for where that came from, 1990. And then we had No Child Left Behind in 2000. But in 2004, there was another reauthorization of IDEA, and that's been the last one that we've had. A lot of people would argue that it's time for a reauthorization of IDEA because the regulations and the rules and the amendments and things have almost outweighed the original document. So it's time for a reauthorization, according to most. And I would agree with that I think it's time for reauthorization of IDEA. But anyway, IDEA, the term came from the 1990 reauthorization of 94-142, which was originally the Education of All Handicapped Children's Act. Anyway, I hope that sums it up. And it really, if you understand where that came from, because it started with courts saying it was okay to exclude kids because he's drooling, because it disrupted the other kids, all the way to every child has to be included and taught based on his individual and unique needs. That's the key, individual needs, and that is very, very difficult. Anyway, I hope that you watch the rest of the videos, because I have a little segment on each one. Hopefully they won't quite go on as long as this one. Try and keep them short and sweet. You can pick and choose what you like. And if you have any questions, just click on the thing, send me a message. I'd be happy to help you out. Anyway, thanks. Have a great day.